a racist stepfather determined to get rid of his black daughter. But when the horse showed up, the unthinkable happened. Subscribe to the channel and write in the comments where you watch this video from. The morning air in Hastings County, Georgia, was thick with humidity. Clouds from the previous night's rain still hung low, clinging to the tops of pine trees. Along a cracked and winding back road, a rusted blue van rumbled forward, its engine coughing like an old smoker. At the wheel sat Isaac Wilson, a tall, lean black man in his early 40s. He wore a gray blazer with worn elbows and a permanent scowl carved deep into his face. His eyes didn't leave the rearview mirror for long. Every few seconds they darted up again, paranoid, haunted. In the back seat sat his 6-year-old daughter, Melanie, a frail little girl with soft brown skin and wide, silent eyes. Her thin arms were wrapped tightly around a stuffed bear whose seams were beginning to unravel. Her legs, limp and unmoving, were stretched across the seat. Folded beneath a blanket in the trunk was her wheelchair, tucked away like a shameful secret. Isaac hadn't spoken to her in 20 minutes. Not a word since they left their run-down home outside Clarksville. Melanie didn't ask where they were going. She just stared at the back of his head, the same way she had since her mother, Aisha, disappeared 2 months ago. Back then, her father had still cooked breakfast, had still kissed her on the forehead at night. Now, he barely looked at her. Something had snapped. The van turned off the road, tires crunching over gravel, and stopped at the edge of Jackson Lake, a remote, muddy body of water surrounded by cattails and whispering trees. It was the kind of place no one visited anymore. The old dock they approached looked ready to collapse, its boards rotted and speckled with moss. Isaac climbed out slowly, stretching his legs and surveying the area. The lake churned gently under the weight of swollen clouds above. A single wooden rowboat bobbed at the end of the dock, tied loosely with a moldy rope. Without saying a word, he opened the van's rear door, reached in, and picked Melanie up. She shivered in his arms, not from cold, but from confusion, from dread she couldn't name. He avoided her gaze, his jaw clenched. He carried her to the boat and sat her down on one of the benches. The boat creaked beneath their weight. Melanie stared at the rippling water, her lips trembling. "Daddy," she whispered, "I'm scared of the lake." Isaac didn't respond. He walked back, retrieved the oar, untied the boat, and pushed off. The vessel drifted out into the water, slowly at first, then caught by a gentle current. Trees along the far shore stood still as though holding their breath. Minutes passed. Melanie sat quietly, her hands gripping the seat. Isaac rowed in silence, his face blank, eyes locked on the waves. The boat floated toward the center of the lake, where the water was deepest. He dropped the oar and stood. The boat wobbled slightly. He looked down at her. She looked up at him. There was no anger in his expression, just something worse. Absence. The emptiness of someone who had convinced himself there was no other way. "Forgive me," he said, voice low and hollow. Then, with one sudden motion, he shoved her. Her scream was sharp and short, a splash. Water foamed, swallowed her. The bear floated up, bobbing beside the boat. Then came the creak of the wheelchair. He'd brought it, too, and he lifted it high over his head and hurled it into the lake. It sank immediately. On the distant hill, grazing beneath a crooked pine, a large black horse named Justice raised his head, ears twitching. He stood still for a second, then reared, nostrils flared, sensing something wrong. A shrill whinny cut through the air. Without warning, the horse galloped downhill, hooves tearing through mud and grass, rushing toward the lake. Isaac didn't notice. He was still staring at the water, at where his daughter had vanished. Justice didn't stop. With an explosive leap, he plunged into the water, sending up a cascade of spray. His massive legs kicked powerfully as he swam. The lake tried to fight him, but the horse was driven, eyes locked on the faint shape beneath the surface. He dove. A moment passed, then another. Then he emerged. Melanie was draped over his back, coughing, gasping, water pouring from her mouth. Her eyes fluttered, her arms clenched Justice's wet mane. The horse swam back, chest heaving, muscles straining. On the far shore, an old man named Leroy Jenkins stood on the steps of his wooden cabin, tossing corn to his chickens. He turned toward the lake at the sound of the scream. What he saw made his blood run cold, a horse carrying a child out of the water. He dropped the feed bucket and ran. By the time Justice reached land, Leroy was there. He lifted the girl down gently. She was soaking, blue-lipped but alive. "You're all right now, baby," he muttered, wrapping her in his coat. "You're safe now." Inside the cabin, Leroy lit the fire. He laid her on a couch near the warmth and gave her sips of hot tea. She didn't speak. She just stared into the flames. He changed her into dry clothes and covered her in blankets. As he cleaned the damp fabric of her pink dress, something fell from the inside pocket. A folded piece of paper, slightly smudged with ink. He hesitated, then unfolded it. The handwriting was clear, neat, unmistakably feminine. "Melanie, if you're reading this, I couldn't escape. Don't trust your father. He's capable of terrible things. Please, hide this letter." Leroy stared at the note, heart pounding. Outside, the rain began again, gentle and steady. The next morning, the news played on an old television in the corner of the cabin. A stern-looking reporter stood by Jackson Lake. Local child Melanie Wilson is presumed dead after a tragic boating accident. Her father, Isaac Wilson, reported she fell overboard during a fishing trip. Rescue operations are ongoing. Authorities have expressed condolences to the grieving father. Leroy's hands clenched into fists. Grieving father? He knew a lie when he heard one. No one would look for a little black girl. Not in Georgia. Not when her father said it was an accident. Not when the system didn't care. But Leroy cared. He turned off the television, his jaw tightening. He looked toward the couch where Melanie now slept, curled under thick quilts, Justice's head resting beside her. She was safe. For now. But Isaac Wilson wasn't finished. And neither was Leroy. The woods around Leroy Jenkins' cabin seemed quieter than usual, but the silence was deceptive. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle outside the window carried a weight, the weight of watching, waiting. Inside the small, weather-worn house tucked between pine and oak, Melanie Wilson stirred beneath a pile of blankets. It had been 3 days since Leroy pulled her from Jackson Lake, soaked and half-conscious. 3 days of silence, of healing, of fear. She sat in a wheelchair now, a temporary one that Leroy had cobbled together from old parts and a rusted lawn chair. Her thin arms rested on the wooden arms, and she stared at the fireplace where embers glowed. Leroy sat in a rocking chair nearby, whittling a piece of wood down to a smooth curve. Neither of them spoke much. The house was filled with unspoken things. Melanie still woke in the middle of the night, breath short, eyes wide. She would cling to the armrest, whispering for her mother, and each time Leroy would shuffle over, sit beside her, and hum low, gravelly lullabies his own mother used to sing, not because he thought they'd cure the nightmares, but because sometimes just being there was the only medicine left. On the 4th morning, there was a knock at the door. Melanie flinched, Leroy tensed, slowly standing and walking to the window. He peeked through the curtain. It was his niece, Charlene, a nurse at the county clinic, dressed in worn scrubs and a jacket 2 sizes too big. He opened the door. "You sure it's safe to come here?" he asked in a low voice. She pushed past him into the cabin and looked at the girl. "That her?" Leroy nodded. Charlene approached Melanie carefully. "Hey, baby, I'm Charlene. Your granduncle says you've been through a lot." Melanie blinked, eyes cautious. "I brought something for you," Charlene said, stepping outside for a moment, then returning with a brand new wheelchair, sleek, light, and fit for her size. Melanie's eyes widened, and for a fleeting second, a smile flickered on her face. "We'll need to lay low," Charlene said quietly to Leroy. "Isaac's friends in town are asking questions, and there's something else." She pulled out her phone and showed him a news clip. Isaac Wilson, dressed in a black suit, tears glistening in his eyes. "She was my little angel," he choked, voice trembling. I turned away for just a second. The boat rocked. I dove in after her, but she was gone. Charlene muted it. Folks in town eating it up, saying he's brave, saying it's such a tragedy for a proud father trying to raise a daughter alone. Leroy spat into the sink. "Ain't nobody saying anything about her mom. No body, no funeral, just rumors. Aisha's friends think she ran away. Cops don't care." Melanie sat still, listening. She didn't understand every word, but she understood enough. Her father had lied. Again. Later that evening, while Charlene made soup in the kitchen and Leroy fixed the heater, Melanie rolled her chair to the window. Justice stood outside in the yard, still and watchful. He hadn't strayed more than a few feet from the house since the rescue, as if he knew she wasn't safe yet. The sun dipped below the trees. As night settled, the girl finally spoke. "Why did he try to hurt me?" Her voice was a whisper, nearly drowned out by the crackling fire. Leroy looked up from his chair. "Because some men, they don't know how to love, only how to control." Melanie turned her face back to the window. "He didn't used to be like that. Grief makes some people mean," Leroy said, "but real mean, that was probably always there, just hiding." There was silence again, not heavy now, just sad. The next morning, a letter arrived. No stamp, no return address, just a folded envelope placed neatly on the porch. Leroy picked it up wary. He opened it, eyes scanning quickly. Then he read aloud. "If the girl is alive, go to Union First Bank. Aisha's safety deposit box is still active. She left everything there, but only the child can open it." "A friend." Charlene read it twice and frowned. "Do you think it's real?" "I don't know," Leroy said, "but I do know this. If there's anything in that box, it might finally bury that devil." They spent the next few days planning. Melanie's wheelchair was decorated with red, white, and blue streamers. Charlene stitched a makeshift school badge onto her shirt. She'd pose as one of the girls in the 4th of July parade, a smiling student in the children's choir. No one would question a singing child on Main Street, not during the noise and the fireworks. Leroy made arrangements with an old friend, Mary, who worked in records at Union First. Years ago, she had dated a cousin of Isaac's and had seen his true face. She agreed to help. In the town, suspicion lingered. Leroy could feel the eyes on his back every time he walked into the general store. Mr. Palmer, the butcher, refused to look him in the eye. Mrs. Crockett at the post office made passive comments. "You folks always got drama. You think that girl's accident wasn't just what y'all call karma." Even Charlene faced it at the clinic. One nurse told her maybe if her mama hadn't run off, none of this would have happened. Another added, "You think Leroy should be hiding a girl from her own daddy?" Justice neighed loudly from the barn when Charlene returned with tears in her eyes that evening. But they stayed focused. Each night, Leroy would kneel beside Melanie and hold her hand. "You don't have to be brave," he told her. "You already are." And each morning, the girl woke up a little stronger. She started to speak more, asked questions about her mother, drew pictures. One afternoon, she showed Charlene a crayon sketch of a house with tall blue butterflies on the fence. She said her mom once told her, "If you ever get lost, look for the house with the blue butterflies. I'll be there." It was the first time she'd smiled with her whole face. The morning of the parade arrived. Fireworks crackled in the distance. Streets buzzed with music and booths. Leroy looked out the window as Melanie, dressed in a little red dress with white shoes, adjusted her cap. Charlene fixed a ribbon in her hair. Justice whinnied once, loud and long. It was time. The streets of downtown Hastings County bloomed with red, white, and blue. It was July 4th, and the town had gathered for its biggest celebration of the year. Children darted between booths with painted faces. Vendors shouted over cheerful music, and fireworks stands lined the sidewalks with patriotic flair. But beneath the surface of laughter and celebration, three figures moved with quiet urgency. Melanie sat in her wheelchair, draped in ribbons and small flags, looking like every other little girl performing in the school choir. Charlene walked beside her, wearing a volunteer's badge and a bright smile that barely concealed her tension. Leroy followed at a distance, dressed in faded jeans and a flannel shirt, pushing an empty stroller in case they needed to switch tactics fast. The plan was simple. Blend in, reach the bank, and retrieve what Aisha had left behind before Isaac could sense they were close. Union First Bank was closed for the holiday, but Marie, true to her word, had left the back entrance ajar. A thin alleyway led to a side door, unmarked and shadowed. They turned down it as the parade music echoed from Main Street. Inside the bank, fluorescent lights hummed above aging tiles. The corridors were narrow and cold. Marie met them near the employee lounge, her hair tucked under a scarf, face pale with nerves. "She has to be the one to open it," she whispered. "State law. We'll go to the vault room now. I've disabled the hallway cameras for 10 minutes. After that, we'll be ghosts." Melanie gripped Charlene's hand as they moved deeper into the building. Each turn, each echo of footsteps behind them, sounded like a trap about to spring. But they pressed on, past rows of safety boxes and polished metal doors. At the end of the vault, Marie typed in a code and turned to Melanie. "Can you press your thumb here, sweetie?" she asked gently. Melanie nodded and pressed her small hand against the biometric scanner. A quiet click sounded, and the door to box #314 slid open. Inside, sealed in a plastic folder, were photographs, printed emails, and a flash drive. There was also a handwritten letter labeled, "To be used if I disappear." Charlene took one glance and swallowed hard. The documents included bruising reports from the hospital, signed affidavits from a therapist Aisha had secretly seen, audio files where Isaac threatened her life. But more than that, bank statements showing missing money, shell accounts in Isaac's name, laundering trails. Leroy's hands shook as he flipped through the materials. This is more than enough to bury him," he whispered. But the sound of footsteps cut through the room like a knife. A voice echoed from the hall. "Melanie!" They froze. It was Isaac. Charlene's blood drained from her face. "He's here!" They'd been too late. Somehow he had tracked them. Maybe a camera, maybe a witness on the street. Maybe he had followed them himself through the crowd. "Sweetheart," his voice came again, smoother this time, sickly sweet. "Don't be afraid. Daddy's here. These people, they're confusing you." Marie's eyes widened. "He's not supposed to be in here. I locked the front." "He must have gotten a badge," Charlene hissed, "or forced someone. We need to go, now." But the corridor outside was already filling with footsteps. Police, Isaac's allies. "I just want to talk to my daughter," Isaac called out. Then came the sound no one expected, a furious scream from the town square. It was Justice. The horse had broken free of his tether, storming down Main Street, rearing and charging between booths and flags. Panic erupted. People ran, scattering like leaves. Screams filled the air. Leroy grinned. "That's our cue." He turned to Charlene. "Take the girl and the files. Go through the maintenance hall. I'll handle him." Charlene nodded, grabbed the folder, and wheeled Melanie toward the rear. Marie guided them through the emergency stairwell that led to a side alley. Isaac stepped into the vault room just as Leroy blocked his path. Isaac's eyes narrowed. "Old man," he spat, "you laid hands on your daughter, tried to drown her, lied to the whole damn county. You don't deserve to speak her name. You think anyone will believe a black cripple in a girl they think is dead?" "They will," Leroy said, "when the files hit the media, when the sheriff hears that little girl's voice." Isaac stepped forward. "You really think you can stop me?" But from outside, chaos raged. The crowd had begun to gather near the bank, trying to get a look at the commotion. Justice galloped wildly, and someone was yelling, "They took the girl into the bank. It's her, the missing child." Leroy could see it, the tide turning. Behind Isaac, 2 officers arrived, pistols drawn. "Put your hands where we can see them," one barked. "What are you doing?" Isaac shouted. "I'm her father." "We got people saying the girl's alive, that she just yelled that you tried to kill her." Isaac's face crumpled. "She's confused. They manipulated her. Hands now." Outside, Melanie was surrounded by a small crowd. She had stood up in her chair with Charlene's help, face flushed, eyes burning. "That's my father," she said, voice shaken. "He pushed me in the lake. He told me to forgive him before he did it. He killed my mom." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Someone began filming. Another shouted, "Did you hear that? She said he tried to kill her." Justice stood behind her, snorting, mane wild, as if ready to charge again. The sheriff appeared, pushing through the people. "Get Wilson in cuffs," he ordered. "Now." Isaac fought, cursing, but it was over. He was dragged out of the building in front of flashing cameras and stunned silence. As the officers pulled him through the street, Melanie watched him go, not crying, not trembling, just breathing. Finally, deeply. Charlene knelt beside her. "You did it." Melanie looked at her, voice barely a whisper. "I want to go find the house. The one with the butterflies." Charlene's eyes welled. "We'll find it, baby, I promise." And behind them, Justice stomped his hoof once, as if sealing the vow. 6 months passed like a slow breath held between storms. Hastings County moved on as it always did, quick to forget the discomfort, eager to return to the illusion of quiet. But the name Isaac Wilson never left the mouths of those who had seen him dragged out of Union First Bank in cuffs. His trial became national news. The footage of Melanie's trembling voice naming him in public, the damning documents, the silent footage from a forgotten parking lot camera showing him loading the boat alone. Together, they sealed his fate. He was sentenced to life without parole. The sheriff who once ignored Leroy's warnings was forced to resign. Investigations bloomed like mold into the roots of the county's legal system. Old cases were reopened, secrets unearthed. But Leroy and Charlene didn't celebrate. They packed quietly, and one morning, just before sunrise, they loaded Melanie and Justice into a rented truck and drove out of town. They drove north, past Atlanta, past Tennessee, into the edge of Carolina, where pine trees stood taller, closer together, and the wind didn't carry judgment. The house was real, just as Melanie remembered it from her mother's stories. A 2-story cottage with chipped blue paint, wrapped in ivy, leaning slightly with age. On the white picket fence, someone, Aisha, had painted dozens of soft blue butterflies. The gate creaked when pushed. A stone path led up to the porch where Melanie froze and whispered, "Mama?" The door swung open. Aisha stood there, alive, thin, tired, older in the face, but alive. The moment held no words, just breath. Just eyes that hadn't seen each other in too long, and arms that pulled tight, trembling, melting the weight of every nightmare. Melanie sobbed against her mother's shoulder, hands gripping tightly. Aisha whispered again and again, "I'm sorry. I tried to come back. I thought he—" But the rest didn't matter. She was home. Inside, the house smelled of cinnamon, pine wood, and something that lingered from Aisha's old life. Hope. The living room had a large window facing the woods. Bookshelves lined the walls. There was a soft rug where Melanie lay that first night, asleep with Justice curled beside her. Leroy stayed with them, taking the smaller bedroom upstairs. Charlene took over the kitchen, cooking meals with laughter that slowly began to sound normal again. Aisha began writing again, pages filled with the truth of what had happened, what had nearly been buried. Melanie began to walk again. At first, it was only inside the house, holding the backs of chairs, using her mother's arm, or clutching Charlene's belt loop, Justice always nearby, watching. Then, one morning, when the sky was soft gray and dew still clung to the grass, she took 3 steps on her own across the porch. Everyone froze. Then Leroy whispered, "Keep going, baby." Melanie giggled, nervous and glowing, and took 2 more. A week later, she walked through the garden on her own 2 feet. Her legs trembled, but her back was straight. And Justice, with all his grace, lifted one hoof in rhythm with her last step, letting out a proud neigh. That night, they baked sweet potato pie. Charlene taught Melanie to roll dough while Justice peeked through the open window, eyes full of mischief. Aisha laughed as flour spilled onto the floor. "These are the kind of messes I missed," she said. Leroy rocked on the porch, listening to the giggles. For a man who had lost so many battles in life, this felt like a victory not just for him, but for every child forgotten by the system, every voice ignored. Word about Melanie's survival traveled. People wrote letters. Some apologized. Some offered help. But they didn't respond to many. The only visitor they welcomed was Marie from the bank. She brought with her a framed plaque from the Child Protection Agency, "For courage, for truth." It now hung near the fireplace, but not all was fixed. There were nights when Melanie still woke up breathless, when she heard water that wasn't there. Aisha would hold her tightly, humming lullabies, and sometimes they sat on the porch together and just watched the stars, whispering that the worst was over. One evening, Charlene brought out a folded piece of paper, one of Aisha's writings. "Mel," she said, "your mama wanted to read you something." Aisha cleared her throat, voice soft. Sometimes the world forgets how heavy a child's shoulders can become. Sometimes it forgets that monsters don't hide in closets. They drive you to school, they cook you dinner. But the world also forgets that love is louder than silence, stronger than shame, and more powerful than fear. Melanie looked up at her, then stood. She walked to the edge of the porch, no cane, no help. The pine trees rustled around them, and somewhere distant, an owl hooted. Justice stood by the gate, ears alert. "Mama," Melanie said, "I'm not scared of the water anymore." Aisha's eyes filled. "Neither am I," she whispered. And as the night deepened, with the stars blinking through the branches and the wind humming soft lullabies, the house among the pines stood strong, no longer a place of hiding, but a place of becoming. A place reborn, a home. What do you think about this powerful story of survival, injustice, and truth? Let us know in the comments. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and share. Your support means the world to us.